Today, I will barely address the elephant in the room that has taken up residence in our world and collective living spaces in couches. Perhaps there has been a slight movement of its significant self toward the door, but just. So I'm going to leave the creature there for a time being, and instead I'm going to talk about the Ascension, which was last Thursday's church festival day. Did you miss the party? On the odd chance that you might have, let me tell you a little about the feast and its significance to the Christian church. This event, that is, Jesus ascending to the heavens, returning to his Father, is the end event of Jesus' ministry in the world. Within 10 days of the ascension, the disciples would begin their ministry. We'll celebrate that beginning next Sunday, the Pentecost. What about the Ascension? The evangelist Luke tells the Ascension story twice. Once at the end of Luke's gospel story of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection, and again at the beginning of his second book, the Acts of the Apostles. The evangelist Matthew doesn't mention a rising into the clouds at all, but in the last paragraph of his gospel, Jesus has called his disciples to the mountain. To the mountain was a clue to his audience that what was to happen in spoken was important. Like in the Moses on the mountain story, in God's covenant commandments written down there to be given to the Hebrew people. In Matthew's story, the handing over is not God the Father to Moses, but Jesus to his disciples. And that is what is being handed over again. And what is being handed over again is the law, but the new law, the loving ministry, the new commandments that Jesus has taught his disciples. He hands the ministry over to them, promising that he would be with them always. Mark's gospel does not include the story, but in the longer ending of Mark's gospel. But the verses of the longer ending are strongly questioned as actually having been written by Mark. They were probably added early in the 2nd century. So Mark's story probably ends with the women fleeing from Jesus' empty tomb, with no story of the ascension. The evangelist John has a different telling of the story. After Judas has left the Last Supper, Jesus instructs his disciples one more time. He concludes this teaching, called the Farewell Discourse, with a prayer to his Father saying, he, Jesus, was no longer in the world. He is severing himself from the life he has had as the disciples' leader and from his duties in this world. Now he asks his Father's help in caring for his disciples as he leaves them behind. This Last Supper goodbye prayer combines several events that will come to pass in the near future of Jesus' life. He will leave the disciples because he will be arrested, found guilty, crucified, rise from the dead, and ease away. There is no ascension scene as such. Just the notice to the disciples in the prayer to his Father that he was going, that he was leaving them. The ascension has an eve, a particular eve of its own, eve as an evening. There are readings selected for an evening service prior to the day of the feast. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and other feasts have eve traditions for the evening before they are celebrated, like Christmas Eve and Easter Vigil, Eve of Pentecost, sort of the party before the party. An eve attached to a feast day marks it as a significant feast of the church calendar. The beginnings of the observance of Ascension are not documented clearly, but it certainly was part of early Christian church practice. perhaps as early as the 1st or 2nd century AD, which makes sense given that the Gospels had all been written by about the end of the 1st century, and the ascension scenes in the Gospels would have provided the early church reason to celebrate this other special day in the Easter sequence. The Feast of Ascension is celebrated 40 days after the Feast of the Resurrection, Easter. 40 days is important in Hebrew and Christian traditions. 40, either years or days, was a heads up to the Jews and Jewish Christians that something momentous was percolating. 40 days or years was a period of testing, trial, or probation. Moses was 40 years in Egypt. He and the Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Moses was 40 days and 40 nights on the mountaintop with God as God formulated the covenant he would make with his people. These times of 40 were preparation or probation time for the people to be ready for their new life. Jesus was 40 days in the desert and rebuffed all the temptations the devil put in his way. And then Jesus began his ministry. So it is likely that Ascension was set 40 days after the Feast of the Resurrection, because this was a time of preparation for the disciples for their ministries, not more time to deal with their shock, grief, and for preparing them for the release of Jesus physically from them. Pentecost, 40 days plus 10 more, is the final point of the disciples' preparation for being Christ in the world, after the sequester in prayer for 10 days after the Ascension. The Ascension of the Lord is listed as one of the tenets of our faith in the Apostles' Creed, which was probably written in the 3rd or 4th century, but finalized by the 7th. Christ's ascension is listed in the Nicene Creed, which is approved in the First Council of the Church in Nicaea in 325. And also it is included in the Creed of Saint Athanasius, approved in the late 5th or early 6th century. That creed is not often, actually never in my experience, read. It begins on page 864 of the Book of Common Prayer. And should you be curious enough to find it on pages 864 and 5, there will be no question in your mind why it is not read. So the Ascension is an important feast day, a principal feast as it is designated in the Anglican tradition. And just because so many may not remember or be able to celebrate it during the week, the Church gives us another chance on the Sunday after Ascension, today, the 7th Sunday of the Easter season. Today we give the Ascension another go, and we do that by reading from Luke's Acts of the Apostles and from the Gospel of John. These passages that tell the story of the transition to disciple leadership of the Church. The Ascension has been the theme of many pieces of Christian art over the centuries. We had some fun at Bible study this past Thursday comparing 3 paintings, one each from the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, which Jessica Bierbaum found in Sentuis. And after Thursday's study, I found another on Wikipedia from the 19th century. The Ascension, as for Christmas, Easter, and the Pentecost, is a visual possibility that artists over the centuries have put to their artistic expression. All contain the figure, or at least the feet, of Jesus ascending over the heads of disciples and Mary, his mother. All very clearly about Jesus' lifting to heaven and the anxiousness of the disciples. But miraculously, in 10 days, they too will come out of their sequestered room from the fear that they will not be able to lead God's children in the way of Jesus. And instead of paralyzing fear, they will be fired up to be what they were taught was the way of life. We'll hear that story next Sunday. And now to end. Please know I love you. More importantly, that God loves you and cares about you. Please be wise, be careful, be kind, stay well, and hang tight.